Rafael Costa, also from San Antonio.
Yes. Yeah, so just like the last one, this is not my paper. I'll do my best to go through this. So for here we use the HoloLens to do the same standard selection task like the previous presentation. And we had 3 different conditions. We had the voice, the gesture, and controller interfaces, where we measured the difference in time, fatigue, and usability scores. So just like in the previous presentation, it's the same selection task. You just have a circle of objects, and you just go back and forth across the circle until you have everything selected. And there's several previous papers where they did this, and we just based our design off those. Now we use the HoloLens, and rather than for our controller test, rather than use the HoloLens clicker, where we had some issues with the battery life, we used a standard Bluetooth controller instead. So the 3 interaction methods, we had the gesture, which was the standard air tap with the HoloLens. For the voice control, we used the word take as the command to select. And for the controller, it was just the trigger buttons on the back of the controller to select. So for our hypotheses, we basically hypothesized that there was going to be significant differences between the 3 different selection methods in time, fatigue level, and usability. So here is a video where initially had some issues with the gesture controller. But in between each point, we have the line, as since the HoloLens does have that very limited field of view, the line would help guide the user to the next object to be selected. And then once all the objects were selected, the user would have to repeat the task, but the bars would move either further away or closer. Like here, they moved closer, so they appear slightly bigger. So for our participants, we had several children, average age of 10 years old, and they were all from a elementary school in nearby in Texas. So for our metrics, the time was simply measured within the HoloLens. For fatigue, we used the OMNI rate of perceived exertion scale. And usability, we used a standard system usability scale that was slightly modified in language. So this was our this was the OMNI RPE scale. We basically just showed the children this scale and asked them to rate how where on the scale they would place themselves in terms of fatigue. With when giving scales to children, just straight numbers isn't very good. It's been found that more graphic scales are better. And when you have a Likert scale, if instead of saying disagree to agree, kids rarely ever are negative. So it's you get far more usable data if you go from something that's neutral to very positive, which is what we did for our usability scale. And usability scale, we had to slightly modify the language of the questions to make it more kid-friendly. Now for our results, in terms of time, the controller was far quicker, and the time between selecting each of the spheres was slightly over 2 seconds for the controller, but the other ones were 7 or 8 seconds. For fatigue, once again, the controller had the least, and the overall fatigue scale was from 0 to 10, but the kids never reported a score over 5. And for usability, the total range was from 0 to 100. And once again, the controller was the highest scorer. So we did a Friedman test if we had any sort of significance in between for our differences. And there were. And the Wilcoxon test showed us that it was only significant between the gesture and controller and the voice and controller. There was no difference between the voice and the gesture. So, the controllers, we found those to be the most usable, as they had the smallest chance of failure. Like in the video, you saw that even though the user was doing the air tap several times, it just wasn't selecting. And having a physical button just made the controller always report. And with the fatigue, the controller was once again the best, and the gesture with the kids having to hold out their arm was the most fatiguing. Now for the voice, in a previous study, we found that the word take rather than the word select was far more recognized by the voice recognition system when we were working with kids. And so before we get to questions, a bit of advertising. If anybody's looking for a job or they have students that are looking for a job soon, we are doing an open rank tenure track cluster hire at UTSA. So.
So I assume that the only difference between voice and gesture was the actual selection algorithm. So would they point and say take in order to make that selection?
We just use the standard HoloLens that has the little dot in the center.
Okay.
So it was you moved your head to move the dot, and whatever the dot on is what would be selected.
Okay, thank you.
Actually also curious about that in a way you're really not, it's not really the same task, right? It's actually the ease with which you can communicate sort of like an enter command, or it's one feature that's being
the difference between them was the confirmation of selection.
The confirmation of selection, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I'm a little bit curious about whether this doesn't sort of tone this test a little differently from, say, the previous test where you have to hit the target, because you could argue this is just about sort of saying the right thing, but of course you have to hold your head still. So do you have some comments on that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
It's not fair to ask it on all.
Yeah, it would probably be better to ask the authors.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you have fair questions for Rafa? In that case, we should thank you.
All right.